magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on striking scorpions, and also everybody's favorite Karen in the 40k universe, Karandras, the associated Phoenix Lord. In these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and how best to play around those obstacles. I also talk about the most efficient builds and number of models in the squad in terms of efficiency for competitive play. And I say something about how competitive the unit is. So that's what I want to start with. Scorpions are heckin' competitive, kids. They're really good. And many of us in the first months of the edition, because there was so much stuff that was kind of overpowered, did not realize how good. But striking scorpions are excellent. They really are. They're certainly the most efficient melee aspect warrior, and Karandras is a strong contender for best Phoenix Lord. I think Fugan probably has the edge on him just because of the resurrection ability, but it's close. And both Scorpions and Karandras have appeared in a number of lists that have done exceptionally well at GTs in the last few months, although most recently we've seen Scorpions without the Karen. Now, as I talk about like what the unit is, I'll do Scorpions first, and then I'll talk about Karandras and whether or not you want him to lead the unit or be a loner. And as I talk about what the unit is, I unfortunately have to make a little bit of a distinction here, because there's what striking scorpions are in the lore, like what they're supposed to be, and then there's how they play most effectively on the table. And here, this is a place in which I think the current index rules are a little bit of a miss. As I always do before a new codex comes out, back in 8th edition, I talked about what I wanted Scorpions to look like in 9th. And back in 9th edition, I talked about what I wanted them to look like in 10th. And it's never quite happened. But here's the disconnect. In the lore, Scorpions are supposed to be these like heavily armored assassin infiltrators that suddenly appear out of the shadows in some ruin that the Imperial Guard have been in for 6 hours and had no idea had like elves in it, and the Scorpions just butcher them. But they're supposed to be these like heavily armored infiltrated infantry killers. And as such, they can infiltrate. They can set up anywhere on the table that's more than 9 inches from enemy models or the enemy deployment zone. But in practice, you can infiltrate with them, and it's fine. It's okay. And in some matchups, it makes sense. But in practice, the most efficient way to use Scorpions is to use them as mobile assault infantry, to have them charge out of Falcons. And this has to do with the synergy between the Falcon fire support reroll ability and their capacity for devastating wounds. This is particularly true if you stick Karandras in there. They become a highly points efficient infantry elimination unit, and if Karandras is in there, they're also actually pretty good into tanks and monsters for not a lot of points. Okay, let's take a look at the unit card and talk about how this works. So 5 Scorpions are only 65 points, which is really quite excellent. They have a standard aspect warrior profile. They move 7 inches. They're T3. They've got a 3-up save. So there are the heavily armored aspect warriors at 3-up and the lightly armored aspect warriors at 4-up. These guys have the heavy armor, and they've got a 5-up invuln, 1 wound on a regular Scorpion, 2 on the Exarch, standard LD6, OC1. They're ranged weapons. They've all got a shuriken pistol, except the Exarch can potentially take something better. And then they've each got a Scorpion chainsword, which has 4 attacks with sustained hits 1. Ooh. Hitting on 3s at strength 4. No AP, sad. 1 damage. But the Exarch has a choice between either the Biting Blade, which also has sustained hits 1, but has 5 attacks instead of 4 attacks, also hits on 3s, but his strength 5 instead of 4 is -1 AP and flat 2 damage. And that's really good. 5 attacks at strength 5, -1 AP. The difference between -1 and nothing is significant in terms of math. And then flat 2 damage means he's good into heavy infantry. Alternatively, you could give the Exarch the Scorpion Claw, which also gives you a shooting profile, which is okay. It's basically a shuriken pistol with an extra shot. But as a melee weapon, it sacrifices an attack and a little bit of weapon skill in order to hit a lot harder. So it also has sustained hits 1, but it's only got 4 attacks instead of the 5 that the Biting Blade has. And it hits on 4s instead of 3s, which is not great, but it's strength 8, right? So wounds Space Marines on 2s and potentially wounds like really durable stuff on 5s, and then has -2 AP, flat 2 damage, which is really good. And then the whole squad has the Manda Blaster's ability. Melee weapons equipped by the bearer have devastating wounds, which for you newbies means that on 6s to wound, they just ignore armor saves, including invulnerable saves, but they only have this when they're not targeting monsters or vehicles. So it's into infantry and bikes, or infantry and mounted units. They're infantry killers. Now, the sheer number of attacks that Scorpions put out is pretty considerable, because even the regular Scorpions are putting out 4. So the 4 Scorpions in the squad together are putting out 16 attacks with sustained hits 1, which means they're going to hit around 14 times if you figure the inevitable misses plus the sustained hits, which is good. And then strength 5 means they're going to wound most infantry on 3s. I'm sorry, strength 4 means they're going to wound most infantry on 3s or 4s. The no AP is not awesome, but on a few of those attacks, they're just going to ignore the armor, so the AP is not going to matter. So it ends up being kind of as good as having some okay AP, like maybe -1. But the Exarch is the one doing the real heavy lifting, with definitely doing 2 damage, and then you're just deciding, do I want more attacks or do I want more strength, and having a harder time hitting. And you get a reroll for Warhost, right? So one of the arguments for taking the Scorpion Claw is it's only 4 attacks, but you use one of the rerolls for Warhost, or your reroll for Warhost, and then at strength 8, if you also get a reroll to wound, you're going to wound with a bunch of those. That's pretty good. The Biting Blade, similarly, the odds of you pushing through, especially if you're rerolling a wound roll, the odds of you pushing through some flat 2 devastating wounds are pretty good. You're probably going to get one through. Now, I used to be of the opinion that obviously you take the Biting Blade for the simple reason that more attacks means a greater likelihood of triggering devastating wounds, and fewer attacks that hit less means you're less likely to trigger devastating wounds. But if you listen to my interview with Boone, like, was it last month or 2 months ago? I don't know. In the relatively recent past, he is a fan of the Scorpion Claw. He thinks there's an argument for both, and he's done pretty well with it. Obviously, it just depends on what you're targeting, what math is better. But they're both viable picks. I'm tend to be a Biting Blade guy. I think the argument for the Scorpion Claw is if you're also running them with Karandras and you're intending to also potentially target heavier stuff. Obviously, you can't trigger the devastating wounds against monsters and vehicles, but having the -2 and the strength 8 may make the squad itself a greater threat if you do need to hit a vehicle and a monster. And I'll talk about why that's more viable with Karandras in just a moment. But I mentioned 7 minutes ago or so that they're, although theoretically they're infiltrators, right? They tend to be much better coming out of a Falcon for a couple of reasons. One, when you just plop down the Scorpions before the game begins, your opponent tends to know like where they are, and anything that would be really juicy for them to kill, your opponent can screen, so they end up not really having access to really juicy targets. And if your opponent gets turn 1, maybe your opponent just gets a beat on them and kills them. Now, that said, there was somebody who finished in the last 3 of a GT recently who ran Scorpions, not in a Falcon, not with Karandras, as infiltrators, and they seem to do pretty well for him. But it's also a 65-point unit, so I think some people just kind of figure, well, if they die on turn 1, they die on turn 1. But most people have found, most very successful players who have found them to be highly effective have found them effective coming out of a Falcon because of the fire support rule, right? So Falcons have a pretty good shooting profile and they have the durability of an Eldari tank, and you can use the Falcon to maneuver the Scorpions into position to jump 3 inches out of the transport. So on turn 1, generally the way it works is you move your Falcon into the midfield behind terrain, and then you can jump the Scorpions 3 inches out, move the 7 inches, and charge. That's a pretty good threat range because they've essentially got a 10-inch move before they charge. And then you move the Falcon and you shoot the thing that the Scorpions are charging and trigger fire support, which lets you reroll all of the wound rolls. So the Scorpions are putting out all of these attacks. They have sustained hits, and then you're rerolling all of the wound rolls, which means you are going to double potentially the number of opportunities you have. It depends on the target you're going into, whether or not it's smart to fish in this way. But you could theoretically double your opportunity to generate devastating wounds, or nearly double it. And if you were attacking something with really good armor, like a 2-up armor save, it would make sense to do that, to just fish for 6s. Against most targets, you just want to reroll the misses, but nevertheless, the ability to reroll doesn't just mean you're wounding more times, it means you're triggering more devastating wounds. And on a 65-point unit, the difference between doing 2 or 3 dev wounds and 5 dev wounds feels big. It just feels murderous with this 65-point unit to do 5 or 6 devastating wounds to something that's got good armor or a good AP, or a good, invuln. But really, it tends to be the really good armor where you're triggering the dev wounds, because they have a great enough volume of attacks that they can get around reasonably well, something like a 4-up and vulnerable save, but it's like a 3-up or a 2-up armor save, native armor save they struggle with. So the fire support really helps. They end up being pretty good at killing Marines. They're really good at killing any kind of basic infantry. They can put some wounds on really tough stuff, especially if you give them the Scorpion Claw. They're just very efficient killers, and those dev wounds can be absolutely brutal. They're really good at killing characters with good invulns. And if you decide to add Karandras to the mix and have your Scorpions led by the galaxy's most feared Karen, the squad becomes absolutely disgusting in terms of what it can do for you on the table. I mean, it's just a fabulous tool. I think I mentioned earlier that when the index first dropped, I was sort of the opinion that Fugan was the only really next level Phoenix Lord. I was wrong. Karandras is really exceptional for a variety of reasons, which we will get into, to do with some interesting synergies around abilities on his card and things that you can do with him coming out of a Falcon. I'm going to run you through his data sheet, and we'll talk a little bit about why he's so good and how to make this the best that it can be. You have a couple of options for how you run Karandras. So he's got the 7-inch move, which is standard T3, 2-up save, 4-up invuln, 5 wounds, 6 plus leadership, 1 OC. It's totally standard Phoenix Lord profile. Then some pretty good weapons. A kind of solid shooting weapon for a not shooty Phoenix Lord. Aurara's Bane. It's a assault pistol. It's got a 12-inch range, only 2 attacks, hitting on 2s, strength 5, -1 AP, flat 2 damage. Cool. Maybe you pick up a Space Marine or whatever. It's just a little extra damage output. But really, of course, it's the melee profiles that are the reason to run him. He has his anti-hard target melee profile, or his anti-heavy target melee profile, and then his anti-horde profile. The Aurara's Bane melee version, so this is presumably a claw, because Karandras has both Exarch weapons, but they're relic versions of the Exarch weapons. So he both has a claw on the model, and he also has this pretty cool chainsword. It would be a double-handed chainsword, but of course he wields it one-handed because he's the Karen. So as a melee weapon, Aurara's Bane has 5 attacks, hits on 2s, strength 8, -3 AP, 2 damage, and sustained hits 1. So just like the other Scorpion weapons. Sustained hits is really nice. Obviously, the ability to hit on 2s at strength 8 -3 flat 2 means he's going to go through stuff like Space Marines, like a hot knife through warm applesauce. And he can even put some wounds on like light tanks and monsters and really super durable stuff that maybe, strength 8, I'm wounding on a 5 up, but you've got a reroll for the detachment power and you have sustained hits. So with 5 attacks hitting on 2s, you're going to hit probably 5 times, sometimes 6 times. That's really, sometimes more. That's really solid attack output. Now, before I tell you about the second melee profile, I want to explain why, or point out why this melee profile is even better than it seems. There are 2 reasons. One, he has a special ability. So he's got 2 special abilities. One is the standard ability that all Phoenix Lords have, where they make the unit that they're leading hit on 2s. Great. Instead of 3s, gives them +1 to hit. But he has sustained assault, which means when he completes a charge move, which is probably the only way he's ever entering combat, on an unmodified hit roll of a 4 up instead of a 6 up, he scores a critical. So he's actually triggering sustained hits on 4s, not on 6s. So that thing I just said about 5 attacks, on average that would generate 6 hits. Really, he's generating 7 or 8 or more when he charges, only when he charges, but nevertheless. That's fabulous for a weapon that is hitting on 2s at strength 8 with -3 AP, flat 2 damage. I mean, -3 is a Banshee blade, right? Banshee's whole advantage over Scorpions is that they have wildly better AP, but Karandras is just as effective at carving up hard targets and heavy armor. Then the other thing he has going for him is this war gear ability called Scorpion's Bite. So this is much like the Manda Blaster on the regular Scorpions, except his is better. It works the same way in that on critical wounds, so 6s to wound, it triggers devastating wounds, bypassing all armor saves, but he is not limited to only infantry and bikes. He can do this against anything that's not Titanic, including tanks and monsters. So what you end up with is a weapon profile that is probably going to hit 7 or 8 times, and against a really hard target, if you're charging, which you're going to, and against a really hard target, you're going to wound it on 5s with the Ahar's Bane profile, and you're going to do devastating wounds on 6s. But if you're coming out of a Falcon and you're rerolling all the wound rolls, now the synergy is insane because you're wounding that tanker monster with -3 AP on 5s, but half of your wounds on 6s are just going to bypass, and because you're rerolling all the dice, your odds of wounding at all are actually roughly equivalent to 50%, and your odds of doing devastating wounds, well, half of your wounds are going to be devastating wounds. The math is a little bit deceptive. It's a little bit like the Monty Hall problem, insofar as like it doesn't seem like half of the wounds should be ignoring armor saves if it's still only on 6s, but that is how it works out just because of the mechanics of rerolls and math. But it's incredibly good. It means that Karandras, coming out of a Falcon that has triggered fire support, opens up a wild-ass elf can of whoop-ass on just about anything. And there's something about putting dev wounds where you're just pushing them through without your opponent facing the indignity of bad luck on a bunch of armor saves that just feels awesome. And he's one of the few Phoenix Lords that feels like a Phoenix Lord. You run him and it makes sense that he is one of the most famous elf warriors in the galaxy. Although there have been many Karandrases, right? Because every time one dies, somebody new puts the armor on and becomes Karandras. That's how it works. But nevertheless, his reputation is appropriate with reference to the rules, which is cool. It's fun. And it's also just an incredibly powerful tactical tool. It wildly increases the like target selection options that you have for Scorpions coming out of a Falcon, instead of kind of really just looking for the most part at infantry and bikes as potential targets. Well, now you're looking at everything, and anything within charge distance of that Falcon is at risk. This also forces your opponent to make hard choices. If you move the Falcon with the Scorpions and Karandras to the midfield behind a piece of terrain, your opponent's really got to think critically about what she's going to move into the middle of the board. Anything within 14 inches of the Falcon is statistically likely to be charged. Very likely. And in fact, because they can deploy 3 inches out from the Falcon, right, their threat range on very average rolls is 17 inches. And their absolute threat range is at 22 inches. So, I mean, this is just, it's an incredibly powerful tool. And again, because they're infantry and they can run through walls, you can get into powerful shooting units in your opponent's backfield that they're trying to hide. But also anything that would try to move into the midfield to threaten your backfield or claim an objective. Karandras is just a wrecking ball for 90 points. And then he also has his anti-infantry profile, or anti-horde infantry, I should say. I really don't actually know how you pronounce this, but it's his other relic weapon, the relic chainsword. Is Izermathil or Izermathil? I don't know. It's got a cool name. It's 8 attacks with sustained hits 1, hitting on 2s still. And again, if you're charging, all of your 4-ups are sustained. So on average, this thing's going to hit like 11 times, 10 or 11 times. And you can certainly do better than that with slightly hot dice. Strength 6, -1 AP. Not amazing, but wow, that volume of attacks. And then 1 damage. And so what you end up with strength 3, he's going to wound really piddly stuff like Termagants or other Eldar on 2s, against really light infantry that only probably saves on a 5-up. They're probably only saving on 6s. He can theoretically on his own with relatively average dice pick up a squad of like 10 peons, certainly 8 or 9 of them. And that counts for something too. Now, tactically, you have a decision to make here, and that is, do you or don't you have Karandras lead the squad of Scorpions? And I actually think that this is a place where it comes down to play style and how you like to use the unit. I don't think that there's a better choice here one way or the other. If he leads the Scorpions, they now hit on 2s, which is obviously great. And if you're going to do this, it kind of makes sense to give the Exarch the Claw, because now having the Claw Exarch at strength 8 and Karandras at strength 8 means that whole package really is a threat to tanks and monsters. And that 2-up to hit instead of a 3-up to hit is not to be underestimated. Karandras leading the Scorpions literally means that they're going to miss half as often, which is great. On the other hand, there's an excellent argument to be made for having them in the same Falcon together, but not actually having him in the squad. And that is simply that the ability to target select different things, because your Scorpions, even led by Karandras, they still prefer to fight bikes and infantry. That's still the more efficient use. And the ability to choose to send your Scorpions into one target and Karandras into another is great. You could choose to send them into the same target. And another advantage to running them separately is that they both get access to the Warhost ability. So Karandras is rerolling a hit roll and a wound roll, and your Exarch is rerolling a hit roll and a wound roll. On the other hand, if the Scorpions are running with Karandras, he has 6 wounds worth of meat shields before anybody can actually get to him. On the other hand, it's not like Scorpions are terribly hard to kill, and it's probably not going to prevent a determined opponent from taking Karandras out next turn unless you're beating the pants off the other player so badly that they don't have a lot left, which happens. There's no advantage to running them together in terms of fire support. You can only choose one target that was damaged by the Falcon to get rerolls, wound rerolls against. But those wound rerolls are for everything coming out of the Falcon, not one unit coming out of the Falcon. So if you do decide to have Karandras and the Scorpions charge the same I don't know, Demon Prince. They both get rerolls regardless. I personally prefer the tactical flexibility of running Karandras as his own thing. I also like sticking him in a Falcon without Scorpions. Sometimes I'll stick him in with 5 Fire Dragons. I don't, despite the fact that he's excellent, I don't run him in all of my lists, not even close to all. Like in the last month, I haven't really been using him. And this is borne out by the fact that the first time I recorded this part of this video, I said something incredibly stupid, which is the same thing that I said when I did the Boone interview, and I do know better. I recorded audio for a couple of different Unit Focus videos back to back after my kids went to sleep, and I said the dumb thing about the critical hits applying in the wound phase. So it's such that like half the wounds were devastating. So if you heard the first version of the video that was only up for 1 hour and you're on to me, like here's me making my full confession. I've never misrun him at the actual table. But despite the fact that I don't use Karandras in every list that I've run, he's literally never let me down. He's incredibly fun to play with. And the entire package that is Karandras with the Scorpions and the Falcon is just under 300 points. It's expensive, but it's not one thing, it's 3 things. The Falcon will continue to do good work for you as a fire platform after Karandras and the other Scorpions have disembarked. And some players even find like clever ways to have something jump back into the Falcon and use fire support a second time. I find in practice rarely does that work for me unless I'm already trouncing somebody. But it's almost 300 points for a tool that's actually 3 tools that's incredibly potent and will be good in every matchup. It's good in every matchup, and I really like tools that are good in every matchup. I will just say, before we move on to obstacles to using them effectively, I do not advise infiltrating with Karandras ever. He has infiltrators like the regular Scorpion, so you could set him up 9 inches from your opponent out of line of sight, because you wouldn't do it in line of sight. But you're going to not do this for the same reason that you don't do it for the Scorpions, and that is if you don't get first turn, he's just dead for sure. Karandras really wants to come out of the Falcon. I firmly believe, I think you can put Scorpions in a list without the Falcon. I don't. Some people do. But if you're going to run Karandras, you put him in the Falcon. And again, the synergy between his dev wounds against anything and the rerolls coming out of the Falcon in combination with his sustained hits on a 4-up is just a really juicy thing to have in your bag of tricks. My last piece of advice about this is, I think that I mentioned that both the Scorpion Chainsword and the Claw have their advantages. I am kind of the mind that if you are running the Scorpions as a separate, either completely without Karandras or just in the same Falcon but without him attached, you take the Biting Blade, right? And if you're going to run the squad with Karandras in it, I think you take the Claw for reasons that we've already been over. So, I'm not the boss of you, but that's what I advise. One more thing that I feel like I should say, just for the sake of you newer players who are collecting. The current Karandras model is really old. It's from the 90s, and all indications are that we're going to get some Phoenix Lords in 2025, and maybe one of them is going to be Karandras. So it seems very likely, because they've already updated the Scorpion models, but they haven't updated the Phoenix Lord yet. So if you don't already own Karandras and you're just playing club games or cash games, you might consider running a proxy for him, unless you're a collector, rather than trying to find a pretty expensive model on eBay that might be replaced with a new sculpt in just a few months. So there's a concern. But if you already own the model and you haven't been running him in 10th edition, I think you've been missing out. I was late to the Striking Scorpion Karandras Elf Party, but wow, it's a good time. And anywhere but a GT, again, you can always proxy something. So Scorpions, I think that's what I've got. They're not as fast as Banshees, and they don't have the AP, but the dev wounds kind of makes up for the AP, and they're a little bit cheaper. They have better armor, and they've got some killer combos that make them a much broader threat in terms of what they can do damage to than do Banshees. They've also got more attacks with 4 instead of 3 on the basic weapon and sustained hits. So much though I hate to admit it, between the 2 dedicated melee aspect warriors, as it stands in 10th edition right now, before we get the 2025 Codex, there's no question that Scorpions, in terms of just competitive viability, do have the edge over Banshees, even though Banshees aren't bad. Which, as an Ibersil player, is particularly hard for me to admit, because I think of Scorpions as being like a very Beltani aspect warrior, but nevertheless, they're pretty awesome. Okay, so I hope that if you have not clicked like, you will click like. If you have your own ideas about how to use Scorpions effectively, please leave those in the comments below. I like all comments. And if you are interested in connecting more personally or just being part of a pretty cool Discord community, I would love for you to join my Patreon, which I will link in the video description. And I hope to be back again pretty soon with something new. And until then, best of luck in your next campaign. Take care. Bye.